all this beginning stuff out. But yeah, so it's recording.
Okay,
That's
great. All right. Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
I'll be in the other rooms whenever you're done.
Okay.
Once you're done too, you just hit the record button and then it'll say slide to stop.
Okay.
You can slide to stop.
All right.
I'll go work on some stuff.
Will do. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, hey, everyone. I appreciate you getting the class in a different way today. So we're going to be recording this, and hopefully just a reminder that if you watch this, to make sure and email me afterwards to let me know that you've done that, and that way you can get your participation points for the class, for this particular class. So anyway, what we're going to be talking about today is ethics, and ethics is just always a part of any profession that someone's in, but especially it's true, I think, of the counseling profession, because you know you're dealing with people's personal stuff, and so there's really a need to protect that. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how to best balance the need to protect that with the client, and yet at the same time be professional in our behavior. And so one of the things that I think is important to understand is that a lot of times when we talk about ethics, there's sort of a negative connotation to that. And hopefully by the time we're done today, you'll have a little bit different appreciation of the importance of ethics and the fact that they're a positive thing and that they can be used effectively in a counseling practice. So there's two kinds of ethics in starting out with this that I think is important to understand. The first one is something called mandatory ethics, okay? And mandatory ethics, basically that's the approach that says there are minimum standards required and I have to fulfill those standards, and basically as long as I do that, I'm operating ethically, as long as I meet all the criteria and all the guidelines. And basically what you're doing at that point is you're just avoiding being punished. And that's great, and that's certainly what you want to do, but I think that there's something that goes beyond that. And that's the idea of positive ethics. And what positive ethics says is that I'm going to go beyond what's just simply minimally required and really have the focus in terms of the best practice for my client. And it's a much more positive approach, and it's much more proactive. It's much more intentional about the things that you're going to do. And so, as we said before, we don't just want to simply follow the rules to avoid punishment, but rather we want to do what's best for our client. So a couple things to talk about generally speaking. First of all, professional codes don't make decisions for you. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, there are regulations and there are codes, but they can change from situation to situation, and how you interpret it in one way may be different than a different context. One of the things that we're going to talk about later is the idea of dual relationships, and how you have to be very careful with dual relationships in terms of what kind of relationship you have with a client outside of the practice. Well, that's easy to do in a town like Phoenix, where there's 3.5, 4 million people, and the chances of you having a relationship with that person are very slim. But pretend that you're the only counselor in a town of, say, 2,500, okay? And now you've got a person that may go to church with you, you've got a person that may work in the same field as you do, that you may be parents of kids that are on the same softball team. So it's a different context there in terms of this idea of dual relationships. And again, we'll talk more specifically about that, but that's just one of the examples of the idea that certain regulations and certain practices may change based on the nature of the situation. So you've got to again, always be thinking about what kind of situation I'm finding myself in. The other thing that's important to understand is that different practitioners differ on how they apply ethics in certain situations. There are no obvious answers. For example, one of the things that we talk about in terms of reporting abuse is that when it's something that's reasonable, that's when you need to report abuse. When it can be reasonably expected that this person is in an abusive situation. Well, what is reasonable? And different clinicians will differ on that. So again, not everybody agrees on what the specific ethic is for the specific situation. And it's also open to evaluation. There are things that I did later in my practice that I didn't do early on because my ethics was always growing and changing. Likewise, there are things that I did do at the beginning that I didn't do later. And so, you know, there's just this whole idea of constantly looking at situations and being open even to changing some of your practices based on more information that you gather and more learning that you have. The thing to remember about all of this is that we have certain blind spots. All of us have those areas in our practice that we don't maybe see as clearly as we need to. And so it's important to understand that our biases, our preconceived notions, they're going to prejudice in certain ways in terms of our ethical responsibility. And so we need to be careful and always be open to hearing new things. So one of the things that we need to ask ourselves when we talk about ethics is whose needs are being met? Is this particular thing that I'm doing more about making sure that my client is safe and protected and getting the best treatment? Or is this more about, you know, covering my actions and more comfortable for me? What can happen for us is that there's some personal needs that can be met that we maybe aren't aware of. For example, the need for the therapist to be in control of the situation. Sometimes that can influence ethical behavior versus the idea of what's right. The need to be helpful. I want to help this client. And so if I have to report this situation, from my perspective, is that going to be more helpful or is that going to hurt the situation? And again, sometimes it will hurt it in the short run, but in the long run it may help it. But we're reluctant to do that sometimes. The need to change others. You know, am I forcing a particular situation or a particular set of beliefs on a person because I know that they're going to benefit from them versus allowing them to make that change? We can get into some unethical behavior by this idea of force feeding someone. The need for me to feel adequate as a therapist, okay, and sort of getting my own strokes. Am I doing behavior that's making me feel good, but it's not necessarily good for the client? And kind of along the same lines, the need to be respected. Am I trying to be respected in my field and have the admiration of other people in terms of how I handle situations versus really looking at what's best for this client? And it's just always important to remember that our professional benefit, our professional relationship with a client exists for their benefit, not mine. That's the reason they came to me in the first place. And there's got to be this element of trust built that I think is really important. And how we handle ethical situations is probably the primary reason that trust can be broken in a particular situation. And so we've always got to be careful about that. So let's talk about these codes of ethics, because you're going to find them, and we're going to talk about some places that you find them. But out there are particular codes of ethics that we find. And why are they there? Well, they're there for a couple reasons. First of all, they're there to educate practitioners about our responsibilities. Sometimes you may not even be aware of a situation that you're dealing with a particular client, and it may seem very innocent to you. One of the things that happens frequently is that clients may bring small gifts or small tokens, or even I remember when a lady was, happy with how counseling was going and she was feeling better, and so she brought a plate of cookies. Okay, well, does that fall under the idea that you're not supposed to receive gifts that would influence the outcome of counseling? Clearly, if they gave me a Rolex watch, I would be concerned. But cookies that she made, am I going to do more damage to her if I refuse the cookies versus if I accept them? So it kind of is an educational experience in terms of helping us understand how we relate to and respond to different situations that we're going to find ourselves in. And the more we can be pre-educated about those things, the better off we're going to be, because sometimes they'll catch us unaware and we're not even aware of how I should handle this situation. So knowing these ethical concerns from the outset is an important aspect. The second thing it does is it provides a framework of accountability. And because a lot of times practitioners are out on their own and not necessarily within a group practice, there's nobody really following up with them in terms of even saying, hey, what about that situation? Or even another person that you can bounce it off of. And so the idea here is I want to be accountable. I want to make sure that I'm doing it right. And so because there's no one I can bounce this off of, or there's no one to call me and check, what I can find here is that these ethical principles will hold me accountable. And if I violate them, and if somebody knows that I violate them, especially if perhaps a client reports something, this is where the accountability comes in, and the people who are on whatever board or group that is checking up on me, this is their guideline by which to go. Well, did you do this? Did you follow these steps? And that kind of thing. They also, believe it or not, serve as a basis for improving our practice. Having good ethics is not just about avoiding getting sued, and I think clearly that's a part of it. We don't want to ever have a lawsuit, against us in terms of malpractice or whatever, because obviously that jeopardizes our livelihood, that jeopardizes our license and that kind of thing. But beyond that, I think the better counselors are the ethical counselors, and the ones who know not only what the regulations are, but how to interpret them in particular situations. And let's be honest, the longer you practice, the more likely you're going to be faced with different situations that call for ethical behavior in particular cases. And so it's important to understand those kinds of situations again beforehand, but also how this is going to make me better at what I do by approaching the situation from the get-go. For example, one of the things that I didn't do at the beginning of my practice, but the longer I was in it, the more I felt it was important, was obviously there are regulations, and we'll kind of address those a little bit later, about when to report certain things, abuse, sexual abuse, especially of minors and that kind of thing. And clearly I kind of knew what the regulations were, but I got to the place where there was a couple of situations where I had to go ahead and report something, and even though that was in our documentation that they signed, I didn't go over it real clearly with someone. Well, what I ended up doing by the end of my practice was I would tell people, just so you know, these are the situations under which I have to report any kind of abuse, and I would set them up for that beforehand. Now, did that prohibit someone from telling me something that they maybe should have? I don't know, and I'll never know. But the reality is, I felt more protected that when they did share that thing, I could come back and say, hey, remember when I told you this at our very first session that I would have to report this? Well, here we are in that situation, and so I'm going to have to report that, and you're aware of that because I made you aware of that. So I think it made me a better counselor because it was cluing them in. so to speak, on what they could expect. So those are the kinds of things that I think these particular codes of ethics are. Now, where do we find these codes of ethics? Well, there's several places, but some of them that you might be most familiar with are, first of all, professional organization codes. If you are a member of the APA, the American Psychological Association, the American Association of Christian Counselors, which is the AACC, those professional organizations that you would become a part of, they have their own code of ethics, and it's important to remember what they are and learn what they are so that you don't fall out of favor with those professional organizations, because those professional organizations are very helpful in terms, for one of the reasons, is to help you understand ethics. There are also state codes. If you become a licensed professional counselor or a licensed marriage and family therapist, a licensed social worker, whatever it is, there's state codes of ethics and regulations that you have to understand, and you have to, when you become a counselor licensed in that state, you have to agree to them. And so it's good to know them, obviously, if you're agreeing to them, because they are the things that if you do violate something, that's the board that's going to come and approach you about it. And then even beyond that, a lot of times there are certain places of employment and organizations that may have codes of ethics that perhaps go even beyond those. You know, how to handle documentation and how to professionally act in the office. There may be, for example, certain dress codes in terms of appearing professional in certain situations. And those are important to understand. And so that's going to vary from employer to employer based on, you know, what they particularly say. But the idea here is that you're not going to just probably be under one code of ethics. You're going to be under several of them. A lot of it is duplicated, but there may be some things that you'll want to know for a specific organization that don't apply to another one. That's going to, again, help you be a better counselor. So assuming we've got a problem, assuming a situation comes, and we have this dilemma, particularly, that we've been faced. What do we do? Is there a process that we can go through in terms of making good ethical decisions? And I think there is, and I want to go over that because I think this is an excellent process that helps us sort of go through the situation. So obviously, the first thing that we want to do is identify what the problem is, okay? Here's the issue. What do I or do I not report this situation? Is this a situation where I'm taking a gift from somebody? Is this a dual relationship? So we need to identify sort of the problem first and sort of spell it out. Then we'd identify the potential issues. Okay, what are the sides to the story? You know, what is the conflict here? Okay, we've talked about dual relationships. It falls under that category. I've identified that. Well, what about this particular situation is becoming sticky? Well, here's the situation, and there's this side of it, and there's this side of it, and there may be 3 or 4 different sides of the story that you can think about. But you wanna look at and identify everyone involved. You know, if it's a child that has presented with some suicidal ideations, you want to realize that you're involved, the child's involved, the parents are involved, there may be siblings, you know, there's school, there's a lot of different things. So you want to identify all of the issues that may be involved in that. Then what you do is that you look at the relevant codes. Okay, in my different codes of ethics, what does this state? Now, obviously, I think the one that you're going to want to look at most importantly are your state codes. And what does it say about reporting this or not reporting this? And I will tell you that some of the codes written in some of these things, like I talked about the word reasonable, some of these codes are written somewhat generally so that there is going to be interpretation involved. And that's important to understand. It doesn't say, you know, in case A, B, C, D, and lists 47 different types of cases. It just says this idea of if you're reasonably sure. So you've got to look at those codes and say, okay, let me read it 3 or 4 times to understand what the context of the code is. And then beyond the codes, are there particular laws? One of the things that you're going to want to be familiar with is the Arizona Revised Statutes, the ARS areas that specifically deal with counseling, because there are actual laws. Forget codes of ethics. There are particular laws that apply to a lot of these things. The next thing that you're going to want to do then, and I think this is really important whether you're in a practice by yourself or not, is to seek consultation. Talk to some of your colleagues, talk to some of your peers, talk to even somebody who's been in the field a while. For example, I'll be very honest with you, whenever I face a difficult situation, and again, I don't do a lot of professional counseling, but in a church situation it may be a little different, but one of the people that I talk to is Dr. Pila, because I know that she's in the field as well. I know that she's been in as long as I have, but she's a lot of times more current with those statutes than I am, just by the fact that she's head of a department in the field, and so continually gets aware if there's changes, where for me, maybe I'm not so up to date on things. So I always talk to her about things. I have a couple other counselor friends that I talk to. But it's really good to get some feedback, because that helps you process it, and there maybe is something that you hadn't thought about. Then you brainstorm your courses of actions. Okay, here are the 6 things that I can do. And when you brainstorm, throw out everything on the table that may even be a consideration. You may reject it almost immediately, but it's important, I think, to look at and consider every possible situation and the potential that it can have. And that's the next thing, is list or enumerate the consequences of each one of those actions. What will this cost me? What will this cost the client? What will this cost the client's parents? What are the consequences based on all of these? And then decide on the best course of action. Now, what's very important here, if you see the way that this is written, is that you decide on the best course of action usually versus deciding on the proper course of action. Because a lot of times there's going to be 2 or 3 potential decisions and courses that you may possibly take. What you've got to do is evaluate, okay, based on all of those consequences, which one seems to be the least costly of any of those, specifically for my client and the people involved in their life. That's the one that you're going to choose, but it may not be the only one. And so that's why you've got to take some time to evaluate this. And then the last thing you want to do is document the process. Put it in the notes and process from 1 to 8 in this whole thing. Now, here's the question that if we were in class I would throw out, but I'm going to throw it out to each one of you individually, and I'll give you a few minutes in your mind, or a few seconds in your mind, to answer the question. Which of these do you think is the most important in terms of potential legal consequences that may come back on you? You thought about it? Okay, here's the answer. The one that is most important in this whole process is the documentation. Because what that shows, even if you make a wrong choice by their standards, what that shows is the process that you went through to get to that choice. And even if your thinking was wrong, what they're going to see is that you took it seriously, you took the process, and you actually went through the process of making a decision. That's going to save you in a lot of cases versus, well, I chose this because I listed them all and threw a dart, and that's where it landed. When a board can see that you've actually thought it through, they will give you a lot more grace in those periods or in those circumstances than if you have just arbitrarily picked an answer and not had any pre-thought about it. So make sure that you document your entire process so that if anything happens, you can justify why you made that choice, even if they think it's the wrong choice. So let's talk about some of these ethical considerations that we want to talk about. So the first one is something called informed consent, okay? informed consent. Now, what is informed consent? Well, basically, the informed consent is the right of the client to be informed about therapy and to make autonomous decisions pertaining to it. Basically, this is the idea that as soon as therapy starts, at the beginning of the first session, you go over and you list, not only in written form, but verbally go over that sheet of informed consent. And a lot of times you'll actually, if you go into practice with a group or if you go on your own, there will be a sheet that says informed consent. Probably some of you, when you go to your doctor's offices, have signed this informed consent. And it just tells you what you can expect, what their practices are, what's covered under insurance, what's not, what's protected, what's not, those kinds of things. That's what an informed consent is. But it's a written document that they sign, but it's very important to go over the salient points of that with the client when you're in your first session. Some of the things that informed consent should cover are the general goals of counseling. Now, everybody's going to have their specific problems, so you don't delineate every specific thing, but generally what can you expect out of counseling? You know, that I'm going to be a listening and caring therapist, that we expect you to be honest and upright and forthcoming in the things that you're talking about, you know, and just those general goals of what we want to accomplish. We're not going to change your life dramatically. That's not a goal of counseling, is to make everything better. And so those are the kinds of things you want to talk about here. Secondly, the responsibilities of the counselor towards the client. Here's what you can expect from me. I will, and it goes beyond, I will treat you with respect and whatever. I will not disclose your information to anyone that you have not let me disclose it to. I will spend time you know, thinking about your case. These are the things that I'm skilled in. These are the things that I'm not. And then the same thing is true of the client. Here's what I can expect of you. You need to be on time. You need to pay your bill. You need to, you know, not come in and not having done your homework. If there's a homework assignment, you need to do that. So all of these expectations are laid out. Then you talk about the limitations and exceptions of confidentiality. And that's when we talk about these ideas of when to break confidentiality. And in a moment, we're going to talk about, there's 4 instances that you can do that. And we're going to talk about that. And you delineate those to the counselor or to the client to make sure that they understand them right away. The qualifications of the practitioner, I talk about the fact that I have my master's degree. I am not a doctor. These are the areas that I'm pretty skilled in. I don't do hypnosis. I don't do EDMR, the eye therapy. So you can kind of talk about what they can expect with that. You definitely want to talk about the fees involved. And some counselors are real uncomfortable doing that. But this is part of the disclosure. This is part of the informed consent, that they need to know what they're responsible for. Because this is a business. There's a transaction taking place. And then the services that they can expect. You know, what can you expect? A 50-minute session. You know, you can expect not to be interrupted except in an emergency. Those kinds of things. And then the approximate length of therapy. Now, this is what, you know, it gets kind of dicey here, because depending on what their particular issue is, therapy can go on for a pretty long period of time. Or if their issue is pretty simple, it may not be very long at all, and they're like, well, I thought therapy was going to be longer. So what you want to do is, based on what they've said, and when you do your intake, they'll tell you what the problem is. Based on what you kind of know, what you can say is, generally speaking, this kind of therapy takes from X to X. And what I would do is, if you're going to err on the side of too broad a spectrum. For example, I would say that this kind of therapy can go anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks. Okay, maybe it's never gone as short as 4, maybe it's never gone as long as 12, but the idea is, if you're going to err, make it potentially a broader spectrum than you think it is, because that will cover you if it's shorter than it normally is or longer than it normally is. And again, what you say is, that's a general situation. It could go shorter or longer, and you want to make sure that you tell them that. So make sure that you're upfront and honest on that. One of the big ethical concerns is this whole idea towards confidentiality, and I want to explain that because there's some mistaken notion of what confidentiality is. So what confidentiality is actually, confidentiality is an ethical concept which makes it the duty of the therapist not to disclose information about a client, okay? Confidentiality is an ethical idea, okay? It is what we strive for, to be as circumspect about the information that we tell others as we possibly can. Confidentiality is not a legal term. The legal term that refers to confidentiality is something called privileged communication, okay? And privileged communication is the legal concept that bars or stops disclosure of confidential communication in a legal proceeding. So I practice the ethic of confidentiality in my counseling. The thing that helps me practice confidentiality is the legal concept of privileged communication, okay? So I want to make sure you understand that. Privileged communication is the legal idea. That's when the law says you are protected. What privileged communication and what that law does is allow you to practice the ethic of confidentiality. So make sure that you understand the two of those differences, because a lot of times people say, well, I can't share this because of confidentiality. No, you can't share it because of the law of privileged communication. What I try to do is practice confidentiality in my counseling. So that's the idea and difference. But we've talked about, and I've already alluded to the fact that confidentiality is not an absolute, okay? Basically, there are 4 reasons when we can break confidentiality. Now, again, understand that even these are subject to some interpretation. But basically, these are, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't put the privileged communication up there in the definition. Now, that's what it is there. But let's talk about confidentiality being not an absolute. Confidentiality is not an absolute, and you can breach it when, number 1, a client under 16 years of age is the victim of incest, rape, child abuse, or some other crime. Basically, the idea is when a minor is involved in some type of criminal activity towards them, then you can break abuse. Not only can you, but you must let somebody know in those kind of cases, all right? So child abuse. Now, where this gets dicey is what says child abuse. What is child abuse? You know, there are some people out there that think any spanking of a child is child abuse, okay? So you've got to understand that. In fact, it was this morning that I read an article where a father was arrested, I forget, somewhere in the Midwest or something, but he was he was arrested on child abuse charges, and some of the things that he would have his children do, in other words, were to do a half hour of push-ups, or to put their head against the wall and stand for half hour. Well, if I heard that, perhaps not the push-ups, but if I heard that they had to stand and put their head against the wall for half an hour, you know, I would have to evaluate, is that child abuse or is that just harsh parenting? You know, those are the kinds of things that you have to address in that. But clearly things like incest and rape and those kinds of things are pretty clear. Secondly, when the therapist determines that the client needs hospitalization. If a client has come in and you determine, and by the way, you document your determination that a client needs hospitalization, then you can actually call and have them come pick up that client right from your office, okay? That's when confidentiality can be breached. I think this person is a serious threat to themselves or someone else. I don't think that they can function well enough outside the bounds of this to really be left on their own. So we're going to do hospitalization. that's one of the times when you can let people know that. Now, you don't have to let them know every single detail of why you believe that, but the fact that you're letting them know that the client is bad enough for hospitalization is the breach of confidentiality. When information is made an issue in a court action, so if perhaps you're called to testify in a particular case. Now, here's the interesting thing about that. That's when privileged communication comes in, but if you have a court order by a judge that says that you are allowed to break privileged communication, you may or may not choose to do that. What you can actually do is say, I choose not to breach that, and then it's up to the judge whether they allow that in court or whether you are sent to jail for, not sharing that information. There are therapists that have been sent to jail because they feel that the information they shared would be too damaging to the situation, and so they've gone to jail for contempt of court because they've not followed the particular guidelines of the judge. So, if you're willing to do that, then that's up to you, but you also can, and you're legally protected by that. Whether you're ethically protected, that's going to be up to you. And then when the clients request that their records be released to them or a third party. Clients sometimes have to have things released to insurance, or they have to have records released to them. Now, once again, here's where I think you have to use some discretion. Because I don't know that the insurance, because they need records released to them, doesn't need to know every single detail about that client. Furthermore, there's a lot of times where we release records to clients where we don't release every particular bit of information, primarily because they probably wouldn't understand it, especially if it's something that's from a very psychological background, and it may look like something that is different. So a lot of times when we release records to clients, what we do is we write a record summary and release that to the client, okay, or the insurance company. And that's a way of not having to share every specific little detail. So that's when the ethics says that you can break confidentiality. All right? What about cultural issues? And again, we talked about this in class, and we're going to be continuing to talk about this. This is something that's really, the longer time goes on, the more we really realize how cultural issues play a role. We have to understand their environment and the variables, and so we really have to recognize how culture plays into even the behavior of parents, of children, in terms of ethics. And the problem is that most techniques are derived from approaches developed by and for white, male, middle-class Western clients. For example, this whole idea of sharing information. The Western culture is very private and very much, wanting to keep things to ourselves. There are other cultures where it's very collective, where it's the responsibility of the community to know about this so that they can help this person. So we have to force the client into avoiding this preconceived mold where we force them to make particular issues. That's why it's important to talk about the informed consent beforehand. And if they say from the beginning, I want my parents to know, or I want my family to know this, or whatever, then we document that, and then we're covered. And we may feel like it's information that I would never want shared with my family, but based on this cultural background, it may be something that they want shared. Another issue that comes up is the whole idea of assessment and diagnosis. And this may sound like, well, why is that an ethical concern? Well, because of the fact that when we talk about assessment and diagnosis, what we're doing is, quite frankly, we're putting a label on someone. And if you put certain labels on someone, those labels may last throughout the course of their lifetime. If you put the label of schizophrenic someone, and it may be based on accurate assessment, but if you put that label on that this person is schizophrenic, they're going to have a hard time getting beyond that idea that I've been labeled a schizophrenic. And it's very, very difficult to move beyond that. So where's the ethical concern? Well, the idea here is that is a diagnosis an essential component versus a detrimental factor? Is it important to call this person some technical and legal name versus knowing what they are dealing with and treating the symptoms of that diagnosis? Now, here's where it really gets a problem, because a lot of times insurance companies won't pay for someone that's not been diagnosed. Not only that, but they will not pay as much or anything for certain diagnoses as they would for others that are more prevalent, let's say. So do I diagnose this person, even though I think they're maybe a little bit over here, do I diagnose them here to give them the opportunity to get the insurance reimbursement? Is it close enough that we can call it that, versus am I just sort of hedging my bets and being somewhat dishonest, but I want them to get the insurance payments? That's not a moot point. That's not a theoretical idea. That's something that's real. And I've had to face it several times, and many times is how far do I go in terms of encompassing something in terms of a diagnosis versus, okay, I just can't call it that no matter what. It's just not close enough, kind of thing. The other thing about a diagnosis, and especially I think from a spiritual perspective and from a Christian perspective, is we want to do a whole person assessment of body, mind, and spirit. And basically the psychological assessment affects mostly only the mind. So if I call them a schizophrenic, am I not going to deal with any of the spiritual issues that they're dealing with, because I'm so busy treating the schizophrenic that I don't see that this person also struggles with discipline in their lives or something like that. And so I think that that's important to understand. Another issue, and I've mentioned this one already because this is probably the one, confidentiality and this one, dual relationships, are probably the ones that you're most going to face in your particular counseling background. And basically what happens with a dual relationship is when the counselor assumes two or more roles simultaneously or sequentially with the client. In other words, these two roles may be going on at the same time, or I may see them as a therapist, but then based on the nature of our relationship, I may have to deal with them as something else after that. Some examples of that are combining the role of supervisor and therapist. I am a supervisor to a particular counselor that's in my field, and I have got to be very clear about the expectations, versus now we're in a team meeting, and now we're just two therapists dealing with something. So how do I, and I don't want to bring, if they give maybe some information that I think is not appropriate, how do I address that as a counselor in this team meeting versus I really need to address this as a supervisor, but this is not the time or place, so now I've got to address it as a supervisor. One of the things that you find in some places is this whole idea of bartering, especially if you're going to be in more of a small town kind of situation, and an electrician comes to your therapist, to your office and says, okay, I don't have the money per se to pay for counseling, but I'll tell you what I can do. You need some electrical help here, and I can rewire, what you need done in lieu of paying, and that will buy me, based on my fee, that will buy me X amount of dollars of services. The problem with that is, are they as good an electrician as you are a therapist? Or vice versa, are you as good a therapist as they are an electrician? And who gets to decide what their rate is versus what my rate is, and are we talking about the same dollars, and so on? So bartering can be a very tricky subject. Again, it doesn't say that you can't. Most places don't say that you can't, but you have to be very, very careful when you go in. And again, written documentation and contracts and all of that kind of thing that are actually witnessed by other people are important in that kind of case. Borrowing money from a client. Obviously, this is one of those things that I can't think of a real good reason why this would be anything that you would ever want to do. Providing therapy to a friend, relative, or employee. Again, some real dynamics there because, again, you're talking about a dual relationship. Even if it's a distant relative, my second cousin's son's wife wants to come. Okay, well, I can counsel them, but what about the family reunion where I run into them and I see them? Are they going to feel comfortable? Am I going to feel comfortable? So obviously, close family members and friends, that's hard. But as you get more towards the periphery of those kinds of things, it becomes a little more dicey in terms of how we handle those situations. Engaging in a social relationship with the client. Now, this one is kind of tough, especially if you're in a situation where you're counseling on a church staff, let's say. Because, okay, I see this person in my small group or in Sunday services even, but yet I'm a counselor here. And so how do we work through those situations? Do I never see anyone from my church? Well, that's pretty tough because especially if I'm one of only 2 Christian counselors in the city and this other person gets booked up a lot, how do I deal with that? So that's another one of those dilemmas that you've got to work out. Accepting expensive gifts from client. Again, where do we draw the line with expensive? Okay, I will tell you a situation, and this is sort of a true confessions on my part, that I did that I wasn't aware of, and at this point in time, enough time has passed that I don't think I can correct it. But when I was counseling a lady from the Navajo tribe up in the northern part of Arizona, and she, I had counseled her for the better part of 5 years, and one time she came and she said, I found this and I would just really like to give it to you and whatever. And it was a little, it couldn't have been more than this big, a little sort of blanket, kind of thing. And it was done in a Native American pattern. And I said, oh. And I thought about it for a while. And then I said, she really wanted me to have this and whatever. And it didn't, it was just a little, in my mind, it was something that you go down to Target and you could pay, $10 for or something. And at that point, it was like, all right, I'll take it. Well, flash forward, like seriously, 20 years, because I haven't seen this client for now 22, 23 years. I've lost all track of her. I don't even remember her last name. So anyway, so we're up. We decided to go on a tour in the summertime of all the national parks in southern Utah and northern Arizona. And so we went to a couple of them, obviously, that had Native American things, and they've got their Navajo rugs and whatever. Well, I saw this rug that looked just like mine. Might have been just a shade bigger, whatever. And I looked at the price, and I'm not even going to tell you the price, but let's put it this way. It was in 4 figures. And I went, oh my gosh, how could I accept that from that person? And now I feel terrible because that was that much. Now, the flip side of that is she lived on the Navajo reservation, so somebody may have very likely given it to her, and so she gave it to me, and it didn't cost her what it was worth. But that was one of those things where if I had known better back then what that would have cost, I probably would have had a really serious ethical dilemma. So the idea of expensive gifts, you can't take it because, again, are they buying you telling them good things in therapy? And then the last one is going into a business venture with a client. And clearly, that's not a good idea because, if it heads south, what happens to the relationship at that point? But I think what's important to understand about these dual roles is that it's not always possible to play a single role. And we've talked about some of these examples, but maybe you can come up with some examples yourself of situations where a dual role is sometimes a pretty hard thing to avoid in certain situations. And apart from sexual relationships, which are very clear and are clearly spelled out in the law, there's no consensus with the professionals on how to deal with them. Nobody agrees 100% on how to deal with them. So what is the thing that you need to look at? Well, I think this is what's important. What is the power differential? In other words, in this dual relationship, is there one person in that particular relationship that would still have significant power over the other one in that case? For example, an expensive gift, a Rolex watch. In that context, what that does is that gives the client more power over you than should be normal in that situation. So that's why the power differential in that case changes the dynamic. So that's what you've got to look at in those cases. What is the power differential here, and how does that change? So how do you deal with these dual relationships? Well, there's a couple of rules that you want to do set from the very beginning. First of all, to minimize the risks, set healthy boundaries early. You know, this is my client and they are my, and I am their therapist. That's how this relationship is going to be. And as much as you may end up liking this client, and that happens, you'll get a client that, outside of this context, we could be great friends, okay? That's really an important aspect to say. Perhaps the friendship is based on the fact that you care so much about their need at this point in time that that's coloring your perspective. And when this person gets well, they may change and their personality may change, and all of a sudden they don't need you as much, and now that friendship changes. So you need to set those boundaries very early. Secondly, you need to involve the client in the ongoing discussions. When there is a situation that becomes dicey, talk about it. Talk about it with that client and discuss it with them. I think that's an important thing. Just keep it out in the open that this could be a problem for us. We've talked about this with other situations in ethics. Talk to other professionals. Have you had this situation before? How have you dealt with this? And I think that that's an important one to understand. If you see that a problem is a potential down the road and even the discussions are not going to happen, work under supervision. You don't always, just because you're not under supervision from somebody else doesn't mean that you can't work under supervision from somebody and say, I want you to help me be accountable in this particular case, and so I'm going to meet with you, and I'm going to tell the client that I'm going to be meeting with you in this context. And then continually self-monitor your own issues, and the question you always have to ask yourself is, whose needs are being met with this situation? If I feel some discomfort here, why is that? What's going on here that makes me even feel the least bit uncomfortable in that situation? That's how I think you can best deal with that. So here's the the wrap-up of this. Most ethical questions are complex and defy simple solutions. So understand that you're going to be faced with some of these situations. Take your time to process them. Study your ethical concerns beforehand and the ideas that may come, and already be briefing yourself with some ideas. Because there's two main questions that you want to ask. Who has the right to counsel another person in a general case? In a case of some of these ethical situations, what would a real counselor look like in this situation? And then you want to personalize that. What makes me think I have the right to counsel this person? If I can remove most of the ethical concerns by asking that question, then it's okay to counsel that person. But if anything comes out and said, what makes me think I have the right? Well, I don't have the right because of this, or this gets in the way of my right to counsel this person. Those are the concerns that you really want to evaluate and make sure that you deal with. So that's our discussion of ethics. Just a reminder that your assignment from here is to meet with another counselor and talk about a couple of ethical situations that they've had and how they handled it. So you're going to want to talk to somebody that probably has been in some kind of practice for a while. And again, this can be a social counselor, an employment counselor, a pastoral counselor, whatever, but somebody that's had enough experience to run into one of these or a couple of these situations, and then write up what your takeaway from that was, that what you have learned about the whole context of ethical situations. So have a great rest of the week, work on your paper, and then we will see you the following Monday on the 11th is when we'll get back together, and we'll see you in class. So take care, have a great week.